Hi, and welcome to Titanic Talkline. I am Alexia, and I am here with I didn't ask how to pronounce it beforehand. I'm always so prepared. Is it Brandon Whitted?
It's whited.
Whited, Brandon Whited. It was the other choice that I had. I
It
ran them around in my head and picked the other one.
it happens. It happens.
I apologize. Brandon
No,
Whited
no worries.
and I found you because of the Titanic Memorial Lighthouse.
Oh, yeah. It's a
hmm
great project.
Well, what else do you do with the Titanic community? Because I know that's not your only bid.
Right. I'm a trustee with Titanic International Society. My technical title is membership outreach, which basically just means I work to hopefully get us some more members. I take care of our Instagram and Twitter page. But primarily, I'm an author and a researcher.
Awesome. I ask everyone the same question because it's unoriginal, but it's a really good place to start, which is what is your Titanic story? Because everyone's is profoundly different, even if they kind of quote unquote start the same, even if it's the same book or the same film.
Mhm.
Everyone's story is unique.
Right. Well, I think my fascination with shipwrecks in general started when I was probably in second grade, because at that point we learned about the Lusitania and erroneously learned that it was the reason the United States went into World War One, which it was not. But I remember being fascinated by that ship sinking, and I went home and pulled down the Encyclopedia Britannica because this was long before everyone had the internet. And
Right.
I read the encyclopedia entry on the Lusitania. And from that point on, I was kind of interested in shipwrecks. But the most pivotal thing for me, especially as far as my Titanic interest, would have been a couple of years later. I happened to find this pop up book for children that was all about shipwrecks. And
hmm
toward the center of it, there was what I would best describe as a recreation of Ken Marshall's painting of the Titanic sinking. And it popped up, of course. And I remember just staring at that, fixated, and reading the description over and over because I bought the book. And I couldn't believe that that had actually happened. It was about a year after that that the James Cameron film came out. And so, of course, I saw that, and all the documentaries were re released, all the books were re released. So it really hit me at a time when I could really absorb it and it would last. It made a lasting impact on me.
That's important too, because you look at I mean, there's not a specific age for people, but there is a sort of age in every person's life when I think you're impressionable specifically to
Oh, yeah.
media.
Yes. Yes. And I was, around 10, 11 years old. So I was very impressionable at that point.
Yeah, and I think that, it's something that we see now when they make documentaries about, I think I haven't seen it, but there's something on Netflix called I think it's The Toys That Made Us, where
Yes, I've watched that.
I hear it's really good, but we're going back and seeing that these things that maybe were inconsequential in the moment or to people that they weren't impactful to are actually profoundly important to the people that they were intended for. Like I think about fads that are in right now, like Paw Patrol is a huge thing for kids now.
Yes.
I'm too old for Paw Patrol. I don't understand it. I
I
don't
don't
know what it
either.
is. Yeah, but for some kids out there, they're gonna remember this when they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, be like, oh my God, remember when we used to watch Paw Patrol together? You used to watch Paw Patrol too? Oh my, who was your favorite? There's
Right.
those little
Yeah. And
moments
we
and
we had our own, we had
sure.
our equivalent of it growing up. Yeah, those
What
those
was it for
things can
you?
have a lasting impact. I'm sorry.
What was it for you? It's not Paw Patrol for me. I'm stalling for time trying to remember what it was.
Uh I was really into this show called Wishbone. And some people remember it, some people don't, but he
Come
was a
on,
dog.
Wishbone.
Yes. He was a
Yeah.
dog, and I swear a lot of my knowledge of classic literature comes from that show.
I That was a really underrated show. For anyone who doesn't know
Yes.
what we're talking about, it was about a Jack Russell Terrier named Wishbone who would go on literary adventures. Like he would hop in and out of books and he would be like Sherlock Holmes and you'd
Yeah.
kind of you'd learn child-friendly versions of these, and modified versions of these stories. But like you were
Right.
saying, it was the first time that I'd been introduced to some of those things because I was a kid. I wasn't running around the library picking up Ivanhoe. That wasn't exactly in my
Don
wheelhouse.
Quixote. I remember he
Yeah,
did Don Quixote.
I wasn't gonna
Yeah,
read that, but Wishbone was.
right. And he made it interesting. Yeah,
Loved Wishbone.
I did too. And Arthur was one,
Oh, I loved Arthur.
which
That was
that
so good.
lasted until just last year, I think. It finally ended. So it went through several generations, but that
That
was
was such a
one
good
when I
show.
was a kid. Same thing, reading,
Yes, yes,
you know.
yes. There's so many books that I just remember thinking into, and there was also that need to wait for new media, for new material. Things just didn't come out as quickly as they did.
Yeah, you couldn't binge it.
No, that's actually what's
No
driving me
binging.
crazy currently
Yeah.
about Ted
I
Lasso.
I
So
still
mad.
make myself wait a week, like the old days.
I can't. Well, I
I
do.
want that feeling. I want to absorb each episode and wonder what's going to happen next.
That's fair. I do
Yeah.
something different with certain shows. Like there's a show I like. It's a cartoon called Ruby, and each episode's only about 20-25 minutes long. So they're not very long. And I personally don't happen to think it's worth waiting a week just to watch 25 minutes, especially because the way they do it now, it's like they make a movie and then chop it up into 25-minute bits. So it's like this isn't
Oh,
meant to be an episode. This is like just a weird ending. So
right.
I'll wait for that whole thing to come out and then I will binge it. But I will wait until the final episode comes out. Like I think this season it comes out in the like beginning of May. I'm just gonna wait till May, not watching anything till then. I mean, it's an approach. I don't think it's the right approach.
Well, it's there's probably no right approach. It's whatever you like.
That's true. I'm learning that with this show as well. People have a lot of opinions about certain things like the
Like the
Cameron film
Titanic.
and the Titanic. People have many
Yes.
opinions on the Titanic. What is your I don't even like what is I don't even have any controversial opinions. It's a weird question to ask, but like what's something that you see people discussing a lot where you just like I don't know, maybe wish people would let it go? For me, it's the switch theory.
Well, the switch theory is wow. Yeah. It's surprising in a sad way how many people believe it. I
Yeah.
was shocked how many people actually believe that, and how, because I remember when Robin Gardner's book first came out, and the debates back then, and I kind of thought that had died away until I got more involved in the Facebook world, and I realized it's still alive.
Yeah.
Those conspiracies just will not, they won't die.
Yeah.
They're too juicy.
Yeah.
A lot of people latch onto that. They want it to be a deeper story. I think is at the base of it. If it's not the switch theory, then it's the coal bunker fire. If it's not the coal bunker fire, it's the brittle steel conspiracy. There's this innumerable. I remember once I actually engaged with a man on Facebook over the conspiracy theory that the ship was sunk on purpose because several people on board were opposing the federal income,
Yes.
the Federal Reserve. Yeah, and they fully believe it, and they get hostile when you present basic facts. But I think at the root of it, they latch onto this because they want it to be a deeper story. They don't want
Sure.
all of this to have just happened because a ship hit an iceberg. No, there has to be more to it when there wasn't.
We look for reasons in tragedy, and
Yeah,
sometimes there are reasons like, well, you know, this happened for sad reasons, or the reason this place isn't here anymore is because there was a war. Sometimes there is a real reason, or hey, these people aren't here anymore because now's a great time to teach children about genocide. Like because that's why
yeah,
there's an explanation. And unfortunately, sometimes the answer is, well, why isn't this town here anymore? A big sinkhole opened up and it's just gone. There is
right.
no further explanation. It happened one day.
Or it was a mining community and the
Oh,
mines are gone. And well, that triggered something. I'm sorry.
oh, that's just one of the scariest concepts, just being like buried alive. Ugh.
Oh, well, I just meant that the mine was no longer producing whatever it was they were
Oh,
mining.
I was thinking collapsed mine.
I
Good,
didn't go
good,
that.
good.
No,
Great. Glad that I could help us out with that.
right now I'm
That
thinking of that though, so that would be worse.
would be worse. But I know what you're saying, and that sometimes things just happen.
Right, right.
And
Sometimes there's not a deeper reason.
no, and as you said, it's tempting to be like, but of course there's a reason. There was a fire, or there was
Yeah,
this, or there was that, or well, Smith was going, it was this one person's fault. It was Smith's fault because he did this. It was Murdoch's fault because he did that. It was Lightfoot's fault because he did this. It was Wilde's
Ismay.
fault because he existed.
Yeah, it was
Right.
Ismay's fault. It was
Right. It was
yeah,
Ismay and his mustache. It was just like you
yes,
start pointing fingers at
right.
everyone.
Well, we have to. I think as humans we want to put a face on. We have to have a human reason, in human form, a reason in human form. I'll
Yeah.
put it that way. You
No,
see
that
that
makes
with
sense.
everything.
Yeah, it's as you said, it's a natural human tendency in the same way that we like to anthropomorphize everything. It's like you like to find a reason for. I mean, it makes sense. You want to find logic in places where there isn't any. And
Right.
a lot of the Titanic and its legacy and what actually just happened in general is highly illogical. Like you think about it now, of course, like, well, why would you be steaming through an ice field? You're like, because that's just what you used to do back then. In the same way that you used to not have seatbelts in cars, it was just
Oh yeah.
how you did things. And of course, now that is ludicrous.
Or you could just walk through airport security.
Even
You
I
know.
remember that.
Yeah. Yeah. It was
Wasn't that
a
long ago.
different work. Yeah. Unfortunately, it takes tragedies and disasters to make big changes.
I think the line is something along the lines of like every safety regulation is written in blood, and it's sad
Yeah.
but true.
It's very true. It's very true.
Well, it's the reason that there's now enough lifeboats for capacity instead of for conveyance.
Right. And of course, the Titanic gets singled out for
Hmm.
not having enough lifeboats. The majority of laymen don't realize basically none of those vessels had enough lifeboats back then.
No, because if you upgraded Titanic, you'd have to upgrade Olympic and Britannic, and then that
Yes,
would force Mauritania and Lusitania to have to upgrade. It would be a ripple effect and a very costly one.
extremely. Yeah.
Well, it's like you just brought up like TSA and stuff. I don't remember, but I'm sure that it was really expensive back in the day to start putting in all those freaking scanners.
Oh, it would have been. Yeah.
Just all of a sudden now we all got, just got to spend a bunch of money putting body scanners here so that people can think they're getting tan.
Yeah. Right.
I hate those things. I hate them so much.
Yeah.
Or the fact that you have to do a lifeboat drill now if you go on like a cruise or a boat. Whereas back in the day they were like, well, we're supposed to have a lifeboat drill, but we'd rather just not.
Yeah. It got the wind was up or something. Yeah.
Yeah, nobody
And
wanted to do it. We
from
couldn't
what
find
I've read,
John.
the drills that were held were pretty perfunctory.
They were like,
Couple of crewmen would get in a lifeboat and it would kind of be lowered somewhat and then they would get back out.
right.
I remember reading about that on the Lusitania, at
Uh-huh.
least during the final voyage. Yeah, it was because several passengers on that voyage were not very happy with what they saw during the lifeboat drill.
Well, because the final voyage of Lusitania was also a couple years after the Titanic.
Right,
Lusitania,
1950.
yeah, it sailed for a few years afterwards. So this would have been with the full knowledge of what happens. So I can
Oh
understand
yes,
where people in Lusitania would have been like,
yeah, and they knew they were in a danger zone. There was a very real. They knew there was a very real possibility that they could encounter disaster.
it was an active war zone, the seas.
Mm-hmm.
This was during, oh man, World War One.
Yes,
Yay!
at the beginning. Yeah, at the
So
beginning of
bad
World
with
War.
so bad with history. Um, but yeah, unlike, again, when Titanic was sailing, that was a time of peace. So your biggest perils at sea were bergs, other ships, stuff in the night. You weren't really
Right.
expecting attack.
No, no.
At least not like
All
that.
that changed in just a few years, though.
It is pretty crazy to think about that. And I know you brought it up super briefly. I actually have an upcoming episode that specifically talks about the Lusitania, but
Hmm.
because you brought it up, I want to touch on it. You mentioned something really interesting, and you probably know way more about it than I do. So you brought up accurately that people often give the Lusitania a little bit more quote unquote credit than it's due for the United States joining the war. Can
Right.
you can you tell the listeners about that? Just maybe break it down for
I
people who don't know that.
Yeah. I don't know what's in like elementary school textbooks now, but when I was a kid,
I don't think I learned about the Lusitania until I was in high school. So let me tell you,
really,
it's
okay.
changed.
Yeah, and yeah, I've heard things have changed quite significantly.
Yeah.
When I was, a kid in like second or third grade, our history book actually said we entered World War One because the Lusitania sank. It made a
Mm-hmm.
direct A to B connection.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the Lusitania disaster. I'm not an expert on it, but it did help uh, turn our thoughts toward Germany in a more hostile way. A lot of people asked Wilson for war at that point, but we didn't actually. The U.S. didn't join the war for another 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And in his declaration of war, Wilson actually did not even reference the Lusitania as a reason. Ultimately, we joined because Germany was sort of strong arming Mexico to join on their side in exchange for giving them back lands that had already been claimed. Uh, in addition to the all out warfare they were raging at sea with their U boats.
Mm-hmm.
That in general is more of why we joined than just, well, they sank the Lusitania, so we're going to get revenge.
It's like you were saying earlier, people really like to make logical conclusions, and it does make sense to just be able to say, well, we joined the war because the Lusitania sank. It's
Yeah,
easy.
right. And that sort of is what became the myth. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, at least when I was a kid growing up, that was what you were taught
I think that's even
overall.
what I had heard too.
Yeah, and only in the last few years has that really kind of started to be looked at again. And people are realizing, well, no, there really wasn't that much of a connection between us joining and the Lusitania sinking. It definitely turned American opinion in
Sure.
in a strong way
Yeah,
against Germany, but yeah,
makes sense to me.
right.
I mean, it's the same way that we're also now, finding out about all kinds of historical events that, weren't covered in school, or details about things that were just either not revealed or weren't important at the time. When you
Hmm.
have, new evidence and new technology and the ability to actually go back and look at things, you discover a lot more. Excuse me.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I thought I heard a really interesting car horn outside, and now I don't hear anything. So I think I was hallucinating. Excellent. That was going well.
It happens.
It
It
does.
happens.
Well, you mentioned that you were an author. Are you working on anything now?
I am. I'm working on a local history project.
Oh, cool.
Um, Speaking of finding things that we're not taught about,
Ooh, yeah.
until about 6 years ago, I didn't realize there were really any links to maritime history in my part of Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
But I've found enough to put a book together on it. In
Oh,
fact,
nice.
their stories are pretty well forgotten.
That's
They
sad.
involve they do touch on the Titanic,
Mm-hmm.
also the Lusitania, the Morro Castle, the SS Vestris, the SS Columbia, Pearl Harbor. Multiple vessels are going to be included in that.
I think people sometimes forget that in the past few hundred years, Virginia did, and the Virginia, Maryland area used to have a lot more shipping traffic.
Hmm. Yeah, and I'm way down in the southern tip of Virginia. I'm almost in Tennessee, so when you get down to my area, most people don't really think of sea travel, or
Sure.
people are like, well, there probably wasn't. Even me with my interest in it, I always assumed there really weren't any connections to these big shipwrecks. But, as John Maxtone Graham said, it's the only way to cross. So if anyone,
Yeah.
it was the only way to cross back then. So if anyone ever traveled out of the country, they ended up taking a steamship
Hmm.
up to a certain point in time. And
Yeah.
it turned out that the sinking of the Vestris, I don't know if you're familiar with that one, but
Mm-mm.
I was actually passing a house going to and from work every day where a family died on the Vestris. They had lived there.
Mm.
I never knew that.
I'm not familiar with the Vestris.
Okay, it sank in 1928 off the coast of Virginia. It was a steamship on its way to San Juan, and it left New Jersey in November 1928. It was criminally overloaded. There was a lot of negligence in the overloading of the cargo, and
Mm.
then it hit rough weather and ultimately sank due to that. And about 112 people died.
Yeah, I just looked it up. That's what it says. It was bound to Barbados from New York City and sank at Hampton Roads, Virginia.
Yeah, off the coast there.
That's sad. There's a lot more shipwrecks than I think people realize. There's the big ones that people are aware of: Titanic, Costa Concordia, Lusitania.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's just, up until, maybe 70, I have no idea when, air travel became to be commercially available. If you needed to get anywhere, like really get anywhere, you were going by boat.
Yep, absolutely. You had to.
You had to, yeah, exactly. It was the method of travel. That's how you got across. And, you didn't have as many, you didn't have any radar or, sonar or cell phones or ability to communicate like you can now. So there was
Right.
unfortunately a lot more wrecks and damage and people that would be lost at sea and you just never know. Or wrecks that, you'd get on the ship and feel like, when will we see you again? Well, theoretically in 18 months. There was
Yeah.
no guarantee of those sort of things. And it was just a dangerous but necessary method of travel.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you were complete until wireless became common. You were completely disconnected from
Yeah.
the world, really, during that time. You were kind of on your own planet out there.
Mm. I love the ocean, but I don't know if there's a lot to fear from living an actual life at sea.
Yes. Yes.
A lot of danger out there.
Absolutely.
And most of it, not frustrating, but most of the scariest is like, it's not hostile danger. It's not like, oh no, bad villains from a movie. It's like, well, we might die of heat or starvation or a storm or
Rogue Wave or
rogue
yeah,
wave, angry turtle, who knows?
Kraken.
Kraken's options. Is there any, this is unrelated to Titanic just because, but you've mentioned a bunch of shipwreck names that I don't know the name of. Is there any wrecks that you in particular think are interesting or, like the Vestris that just kind of are a little bit on the forgotten side that
Yeah,
you kind of want to talk about for a sec? Because I
yeah.
like learning.
I'm actually very interested in a ship called the SS Columbia, which sank off the coast of California in 1907. It was a coastal steamer. Um, it was first built in 1880, so by 1907 it was an older ship. But in 1880, it was actually the first use of electricity on a ship.
Oh,
Uh, Thomas Edison actually supervised the installation of the lights on the Columbia.
neat.
And I had never heard of it until I was actually doing this local history research, and I discovered that a local man actually died in the sinking. And from there, I kept looking into it. I've been able to contact a number of descendants, and they've all had these like amazing, crisp pictures of their relative who died. And with the survivors, I've gotten all these accounts, and it's just so fresh because nobody's really looked into the Columbia. But it's really caught a hold of me. It's something I've worked on. I did an article on the local man who died, and then I have another article coming out in Voyage through Titanic International Society that's more of a general telling of the story.
Mm-hmm.
It was very tragic because it sank in about 10 minutes.
Wow.
and maybe even a little less, but around 10 minutes at about 12:30 a.m. after colliding with a schooner off the coast of California. So it went down very quickly. There was very little chance for people to get out. And it had on board a group, and I've not determined the exact number, but there was a good sized group of teachers returning from a national teachers conference in Los Angeles. And all but just a few of them perished.
That's really sad.
Most of the children died. Early reports say all the children died, but I have found that at least a couple survived. One was 16. You could technically consider her a child.
I would consider that a child.
Right, especially at that time because they didn't use the phrase teenager. You were still a child at that time.
That's another thing.
But she actually saved the life of an adult man.
Wow.
She helped hold him up. He was injured. She helped hold him up in the water. And there's just all these amazing stories related to the Columbian. They are completely forgotten.
Yeah.
So that's one
right
that's one that's really interested me in the last few years.
That reminds me of one that I've mentioned on my show a couple of times, much more recent that I have a personal interest in, and that is the Seawall Ferry. And that
I don't think I'm familiar with that.
That sunk off the coast of South Korea in 2013. I believe it was 2013.
Okay.
Same thing. It was a ferry. It was horrifyingly overloaded, and it had a lot of students and teachers on board for a class trip.
Wow. I do think I remember that happening now.
Oh, that sank in real time on the news. It was upsetting. Okay. It was sad. Yeah. There was voicemails being played from these children and videos on social media and photos, and it was very upsetting. And then it, of course, comes to find out there was corruption 78 layers thick, and the captain and some of his higher-up crew just abandoned ship after telling everyone to stay in the cabin.
Remember that. Yeah.
All right. Yep. That's the one. That's the one.
I remember that. Yes. That was terrible.
Ridiculously terrible, and also horribly modern. For something of that nature to be something of that graphic, upsetting, and egregiously corrupt natures. Like, this is so very reminiscent of things that would happen in 1912.
Yeah, it still happens.
I know. And when you were telling me about the Columbia, I was thinking, it's like, this sounds like it repeated itself pseudo recently. I mean, obviously there's differences, but it just goes to show that we can make as many changes as we like, but there are still going to be things that happen when, greed gets in the way. Overloading.
Human nature and nature, the ocean. Yeah, there's always going to be a chance that something like that can happen.
And that's what happened with, Titanic. I don't think that, from what I understand, speaking of like overloading, that was very much not the case on Titanic. They had way less in capacity for passengers. They had, there was a coal strike at the time. There was a bunch of variables happening. So it's not like it was wildly overloaded. It was not crazy overcrowded. There were some, I don't know what I'm trying to say, like dangerous things, like maybe, risky things. There we go. Those are risky behaviors, maybe going too fast, things of that nature. But for all intents and purposes, in hindsight, sure. But again, in the moment and for all intents and purposes, they were just kind of doing, and they're, by contrast, they were in no way going as fast as, say, Mauritania would have been going.
No.
Just by nature of how fast they go.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're just faster.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I don't think anyone would have criticized Lusitania for going that speed, just because it's like, well, what would you expect her to do? That's how fast she goes. Like, what? But yeah, I'm just guessing.
It's hard to say.
Sure.
It's hard to say, really.
I mean, it's like you have to rely on all like testimony and do the best you can piecing things together. But I think the conclusion that every sort of expert that I've spoken to is that the men on Titanic, for all intents and purposes, did everything they could within their power, and especially in those 30 seconds after the sinking, after the collision, when the orders were being given and everything was being executed, that they did what they were supposed to do as quickly as they were supposed to do it.
Yeah, and came very close to avoiding the iceberg.
Mm-hmm.
Very close. Yeah, it's easy to play armchair sailor or whatever Monday morning quarterback and say, well, they should have did this or they should have did that. But of course, the officers were very seasoned for the most part. They were top pick. That's why they were there. And Murdoch, of course, years earlier had actually helped the Arabic when he was on the Arabic, prevented it from colliding, I think, with another ship by overriding the chief officer's order and grabbing the helm himself and swinging it out of the way. So yeah, he's very very confident.
Mm-hmm. Well, all of the officers, at least from what I understand on Titanic, were very competent.
Yeah,
I mean, as you said, they were handpicked for this voyage for a reason.
right, right, yeah, and the older ones, had started their careers all the way back in under sailing, vessels. So yeah, they definitely knew their business.
I asked Dan Parks this a long time ago, and I forgot because that's how good, smart people do things. But if you wanted a career at sea, if you wanted to be a Wild or Murdoch or a Lightoller, how, shush, she doesn't know the answer. How old would you be when first stepped foot on your first ship or your first boat? I don't know how old you'd be and what the first classification of vessel would be, but how old would you be when you started?
Um, Definitely not something I'm an expert on, but from what I've read, I know a lot of them started when they were around 14.
So young. I mean, I wasn't
Yeah,
looking
they
for a
were
specific age.
teenagers. Yeah.
Right.
Captain
Jesus fucks.
Smith, if I'm not mistaken, was like 13 and started as like a cabin boy. Yeah.
Yeah. The point I was only trying to illustrate was that the people on the Titanic's crew, this wasn't day one. This wasn't,
No.
oh, I'm honored to be here, sir. I'll do a great
Right.
job.
No, no, most of them, well, at least in the, on the bridge realm
Yeah, the
were,
high ranking up. I'm
yeah,
sorry for
that's
listeners. I'm talking about ranked officers. I'm not talking about
right.
every
No,
single sailor on the ship.
right. I mean, it's really a life, not just it wasn't just a job. It was a life, almost a lifetime commitment.
Yeah. I mean, the joke, not joke, but I mean, the statement, a life at sea was a statement, not a joke.
Right.
I
Right.
mean, you meant it. And
They,
if you quit your life at sea, something happened.
they were on a vessel much more than they were in their house. You know, it was, it was truly their life.
I mean, it makes sense. We were just talking about how this was the way to travel. This
Mm-hmm.
is how, and your job was to ferry these things. Like, I have my Titanic mug right in front of me. So, like, if Titanic had made it, if you were one of the crewmen on the ship, you don't just get to New York and get to hop off and do whatever you want. You get right back out. You got to get back to Southampton, do that road again, do that line again, however many times, and then maybe you do it indefinitely, or maybe you do it 4 times because you're then going to the Olympic to do it all over again. And then in the next 4 years, you're going to go back to Titanic because you're part of the White Star Line, and this is what you do.
Yeah. Yeah. It was not a lot of turnaround time, not a lot of family time or shore time. I think you had to love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You did, you would be very miserable.
Well, I think it reminds me a lot of careers now, like medicine and law, where you have to make those choices really early to stick with and in for an extremely long period of time. You have to know that you're gonna want to do that because by the time you finish with, your residency or by the time you're actually eligible to practice, law independently or whatever it is you want to be, your peers may be far and away into their careers
Right.
or have the ability to kind of switch, whereas you may be not stuck's not the word that I want because that's not what you mean, but be like you start when you're 15 years old at sea and come back when you're 30 years old. You've got 15 years on the ocean. That's 15 great years, but that has taught you absolutely nothing about a typewriter.
Right.
And it explains to me a lot why, and I think it's surprising for some people to learn how many of the surviving officers ended up going back to careers at sea. Not all, but most, and it's sort of surprising. But when you think about how few options there were to branch out.
And that was really what they knew. I mean, that was all they knew. I think one of them, I believe it was Pittman, ended up as a purser later on, or worked in the purser's department. His eyesight started failing, and
Right.
at that point he transitioned, of course, off the bridge
Mm-hmm.
into the purser's department. Yeah, all of them, in some way stuck with it.
I was thinking of Charles Jochen, for example.
Mm,
Jochen, and I think almost as soon as he was done giving his testimony, he was back baking on the Olympic or something.
I believe
That
so.
yeah. I mean, I think Lightoller went right back on another ship. I think
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, his name was in my head and now it's gone. Other officer person went back out to sea.
Boxall.
There we go. I was having a moment there. I like how you saw me making an extremely weird gesture in the
I was like,
distance,
oh,
and
Boxhall.
I
Yeah,
was drawing a box.
it's a box.
It's a box. Thank you so much. I'm sorry, listeners, that I was just making it doesn't even look like a box now that I see the motion I was making. It looks like a circle. Just
Yeah,
managed
it
to figure it
worked.
out. But I mean, yeah, they didn't have the option, after the disaster, I kind of joked about it on my show before, where it's like they didn't immediately get whisked away to a grief counselor and given a
No,
blanket and soup and told, it's okay, we're gonna set
no,
you up. You stay here and you do all these things, all these wonderful things that we now
right.
know you
No,
need.
yeah, they didn't have that.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, they didn't have that. It's why you see some survivors coping in much less than healthy ways.
By not really coping.
Not really coping, no.
Yeah.
Alcohol or another marriage or, both.
Well, even now we're not the greatest with, we address the issues, but back then it was just sort of like you'll be all right. Pat on the
Yeah.
back. You'll
Yeah,
be all
we're
right.
just now coming to a place where it's more acceptable to talk about your mental health and
Mm-hmm.
address it. Yeah,
And there were,
hopefully that continues in that direction.
I hope so, because you see in the wake of many of these shipwrecks, not just Titanic, from the survivors, a lot of guilt and unfortunately a lot of suicides.
Yes, yes,
Almost too many.
yeah. Survivor's guilt is a very powerful thing.
Oh, I'm not going to be able to remember this man's name. He was one of the survivors of Titanic. I don't remember how old he was, but I want to say he was younger. You're probably going to remember this name as I tell the story. But I think he was invited to the filming of A Night to Remember to be on set when he was an adult. And he was this Night to Remember, was this 97's Titanic? No, it can't have been 97's Titanic. He'd been way too old. This had to have been A Night to Remember. But I guess they had to hold him back because he was
Lawrence
attempting,
Beasley.
thank you, Lawrence Beasley, who was attempting to drown himself in the first class dining room set
Uh,
as it flooded. I don't
well,
remember the exact.
he was a
Yep.
consultant. He was a
Yes.
consultant on the film in 1958. So at that point, he was probably in his 70s, and
Mm-hmm.
he had been a second class passenger on the maiden voyage. Was one of only 13 adult males in second class to survive.
Yeah.
Um, when they were doing the scene with all the extras on the boat deck, and they were going to have the water crash upward, they caught him on the set. Um, and restrained him. And from what I remember reading, I think he had tears in his eyes, and he said, I wanted to go down with her this time," or something to that effect.
Mm.
Yeah, that's a really sad story. He kind of wanted to, he wasn't really intending to drown himself, but
No, no. I mean, but even if it was just
sort
a
of be a
moment.
victim in that moment, he would be able to kind of, I don't know, balance it out in his mind, maybe. Like I went down with her that time.
Mhm.
You know.
I mean, I'm not. We're just saying that people shouldn't be, Monday morning quarterbacks. I'm not going to be an armchair psychologist or anything, but like, regardless of the reasoning, even if it was just sort of like a moment of panic's not the word, but a moment of just like emotion or sadness or just being, flashing right back to that moment again. Because I can see how that might bring you back to
Yeah, I
that
can't
moment.
imagine like being a consultant on
Uh-uh.
something like that, having survived it.
Yeah,
And
turning to them. So,
seeing
Miss,
that scene, I can't
no,
imagine the feeling. Like I don't feel like I would want to be there, but I don't know.
no. I don't know
Yeah.
how I'd respond to someone turning to be like, so Alexia, was that what it was like when the water came up and washed away all your family, or was it a little bit less?
Right.
Was it more subtle than that? Or like, could you see the terror in their eyes? Or did you just turn around and they were gone? It'd be like,
Yeah. And one of the things with those consultants is the ones that were there they didn't lose anyone on board. Not,
mm-hmm,
because Beasley was traveling alone. I
mm-hmm,
know Edith Russell visited the set and she was traveling alone. And
sure.
uh, Boxhall actually was a consultant, which surprised his family a lot because
Yeah.
he hadn't really talked about it until that point.
I'm not going to
Uh,
talk about it to anybody except for everyone involved with this film. Okay, honey.
and maybe that was his way of making peace with the past. I don't know.
I
Uh,
get it. I understand.
yeah, there's
Tell
a
it once, get it
picture.
out.
Right, there's a picture of him that I absolutely loved. He's sitting in a dark theater watching A Night to Remember, and it's taken from behind his seat. You just see him looking up at the screen, and on the screen is the Titanic sinking. He's
Ugh.
all alone in that theater. It's just such a
I just looked it up.
gripping picture. Yeah,
Ooh.
what was going through his mind watching that. I
It
always wondered.
looks it looks like a staged photograph, listeners. It's as he
Yeah,
said, Boxhall's right here, and he's just being the only thing you see is his, profile being lit by the screen where the Titanic is sinking.
it's a
It looks
powerful picture.
staged.
Yeah,
It's not, but it ooh.
well,
Well, it might be a little bit,
it could
but
be. It could have been.
that would be a really interesting act, Mr. Boxhall. I have this amazing idea for a shot. I just need you to watch that for a second.
Yeah, relive this moment. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I'm making
by
light of it,
yourself
but
in darkness. Yeah, that's a
I,
powerful image, though.
that is, and that almost, I mean, it has something to do with the film, but it almost has nothing to do with the film.
Yeah,
Or like you could be looking at a poster for the thing, but it's just interesting to see how people react. And I mean, I excuse me, I know nothing about Lawrence Beasley as a human being or anything, but I can imagine where that would be kind of tough to sit through, even if you were sane up until that moment, just had a moment of where your brain just shut off and then it shut right back on and you were like, whoa, sorry about
right.
that, everybody. I'm back. Even if you just had that like 1 second where you were completely lost at it, it's like that's understandable, and I can see where that would be a lot.
I get where he was coming from.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to verbalize it, but you can kind of. He was probably feeling like that would balance things out, and I don't know.
Survivor's guilt and all these psychological phenomena, they don't really make any sense when you actually break down the thought process, because you and I talking about it, we're like, no, it doesn't make sense to die on a movie set because you didn't die during the real thing. I mean, it sounds patently insane to say it out loud, but I'm sure that in the moment for him it was a completely logical thing to do. It was like, this will fix everything. I'm going to feel so much better.
Oh yes, I don't think they ever really. I don't think he ever really elaborated on it very much either, and probably wasn't asked about it.
I push it down, push it
Yeah,
down.
kind of like, well,
He lived.
yeah, again.
That snuck up on me. It's it kind of just reminds me of like, this is going to sound like I'm making a silly comparison, but videos where people are doing something silly and then for a second it's dangerous. Like I was watching a TikTok someone showed me of a girl who was holding the railing of a boat and dancing, but
Hmm.
then she jumped at the same minute that the boat went down, and for a second it looked like she was going to go over the railing.
Oh,
And they were at the back of the boat, so that would have been right into the propellers.
oh,
And yeah, so but luckily for her, she landed right back down. But the soundtrack to the background is people going, "Woo, yeah!" they're laughing because it's the relief of, oh, whoa, oh,
Right.
she's okay. Woo, she's okay. It's that
Yeah.
extreme reaction of the moment has passed, but it's just the way that you're reacting because you're scared. Because in that moment you were like, oh my God, Sarah's about to go over the boat.
Yeah. And then you're so relieved, all you can do is laugh.
Exactly. And sometimes all you can do is like laugh or cry or just move on. And
Yeah.
I think that sometimes like maybe that's what they did, or just Boxall was just kind of like, that was weird, lunch. Like, or it's like maybe it's not how you want to react, but it's just kind of like you just gotta move on. I mean,
Yeah.
not Boxall, Beasley. Excuse me.
Beasley, yeah. Yeah, it might have been a little, this is a little emotional moment.
It
Yeah.
would have been.
I mean,
I
we really
mean,
don't know. It was mentioned,
no,
but I don't think it was really ever detailed. I don't think that incident was detailed very
no.
much.
I just think that it's a good example of how it would affected the survivors, even outside of the officers. I mean, some of you hear the more tragic ends. Fleet ended up taking his own life, and
Right.
Robert Hitchens came to an extraordinarily tragic end.
Oh,
You know,
yes.
they're
Eloise Hugh Smith, who I wrote
hmm
the book about. Yeah,
you know
very
they,
tragic.
they are, and you hear these sad stories where you find people talk like, yeah, my grandmother, I didn't know she was a Titanic survivor until like she died, and she never talked about it. People who are just so hurt by it that they kept it inside. It's like there was a lot of different reactions to how things happened after the sinking, and you know you can't help feel sorry for every single one of them.
Right. Yeah, a lot of people never talked about it until much later in life. Like
Mm-hmm.
we think of Ruth Becker and Eva Hart. I know I sort of grew up seeing them on documentaries, and I was
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, well, they were always very outspoken, but in reality, they didn't start talking about it until around that time.
Yeah.
It wasn't something they always talked about. Then you have one of the men I've researched a lot is Robert Williams Daniel, um, fellow Virginian, and he really never mentioned it after 1912.
I get it.
Yeah,
Yeah. It again, and maybe if back then we had these, Facebook groups now where you could join Virginia Titanic survivors, have your little meetup. I mean,
yeah,
it sounds like I'm being kind of glib, but what if they had, it would be nice if they'd had those networks, or if you had, you could, if they'd set up a hotline, like if you were a Titanic survivor, call here for free mental health consultations or whatever.
yeah. When
If
the
things
early
might,
days,
mhm.
in the early days of the Titanic Historical Society, they would do little conventions, and you would have a number of them uh,
Mm-hmm.
getting together for the first time since the
Yeah,
sinking.
yeah, I can see that. And that must have been a very unique experience for them.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure they compared notes and
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
It's the sort of thing that you just don't understand unless you've been through it, and you can try your very hardest by listening to the things that people tell you, but unless you've been through that exact experience, you don't connect on that same way. So I feel that seems like the network that TIS was trying to foster for them is really important. I'm sure they
Hmm.
probably appreciated it a lot.
Yeah, yeah. I think most of them did, and
That's
of
good.
course, you also had back to Robert Williams Daniel. He and
Mm-hmm.
Eloise Hugh Smith actually married um,
Oh,
2 years after the sinking. Those two survivors married, which is they were the only two who weren't romantically linked before the sinking who ended up getting together. They actually met on the Carpathia, and
that's abundantly cute, actually,
it is, yeah. But
to have somebody there that knows.
yeah, I mean, knows what you went through.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's incredible. I love learning. I wrote down the names. I love learning about new things and new people because, oh, I just hit a button. I, whoops. Well, I realize that the longer that I do this show, the more I realize that like all these incredible links to people. Like I'm from Maryland. I
oh,
was
okay.
born and raised in Maryland. I live in Texas now, but I don't want to. It's too hot and I'm allergic to everything here. But I didn't know about either of these people, and they're in you, and this is all in my, it's next door to me. There's so many more connections than we're aware of, not just to Titanic, but
Mhm.
to all
Well,
kinds of shipwrecks and disasters and seas and portals and portals,
you have
places.
there's a Texas town named after a Titanic passenger.
Which one?
Um, I want to say it's called Roe, Texas.
Maybe. Hold on.
His name was Arthur Roe. If Yeah, this is off the top of my head, so I might not be exactly correct, but I do know he was a victim in first class, and they named a town in
Nice.
Texas after him.
I'm gonna have to actually look that up, but I'm not very
I
smart about it.
believe I believe it's Roe, Texas, and
You're probably right.
I think it was Arthur Roe.
Alfred Rowe?
Is it Alfred?
There's a person named Alfred Rowe who was from Texas.
Yeah, that's
Cool.
him. Yeah.
But there's all kinds of interesting links all over, and it's interesting to keep learning about them. Like I didn't know about Eloise Hugh Smith and
Oh,
Robert Williams Daniel. I mean, I'd heard the names, but I didn't know they were from Virginia.
Eloise was from West Virginia, and Robert was from Virginia. And they met on the Carpathia and were married in 1914. Of course, Eloise was on the Titanic returning home from her honeymoon. She was pregnant and lost her husband in the sinking.
Mm.
Yeah. So, and that was actually, she was the subject of my first book, Gilded Tragedy.
I was just about to say, before I let you go, you need to tell me what your book's called.
Yeah, it's called Gilded Tragedy, West Virginia's Titanic Widow.
I could have written this on a new piece of paper, but I wrote it in the corner of one instead, all awkwardly, like a smart person. But you, listeners, should write it on a real piece of paper and not do what I did, because that was not smart.
It's the only full-length biography of her that's been written so far.
Nice. Awesome.
Worked extensively with her granddaughter. There's a lot of photographs from Eloise's photo albums that the granddaughter and I sort of sifted through and identified things in. It was a labor of love.
That's amazing. I absolutely need to get a copy of this. But before I let you go, is there anything else you want to tell us or me or?
Just thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this podcast.
Well, thank you for coming on. It was
and
an
having
honor.
A variety of people on.
It is a fun variety, I think.
Yeah, it's a good. You have a lot of different people on.
That is true.
I would encourage people who are truly interested in the Titanic to look into maybe joining a society, because there are things you get in the journals that will never be online. And like I said, I'm a trustee with Titanic International Society. So if any of your listeners are interested in joining us, our website is TitanicInternationalSociety.org. And our dues are $50 per year. You get 4 issues of our journal, Voyage, which contains a lot of exclusive material and new finds. We would love to have you as a member.
I will also put that links and all that in the episode description when it comes out.
Oh,
so
thank you.
Yeah, don't worry about writing it down if you're driving or something. If you want to join the society, I'll make that easy for you to find. You'll make that easy for you to find, because we would like you to join the society safely.
Yes, safely after you park.
Right. Thank you, Brandon, so much for coming on and talking to me.
Thank you for having me.